Part 1. Roll Call. Children are not things to be molded, but are people to be unfolded. They came from all walks of life, both humble and grand, but they all came for the same purpose. The kindergarten took them, molded them, folded them, and either brought out their full potential or sent them below forever. Wherever they went, the results were the same. No one escaped the kindergarten in the end. Well, except one, I suppose. Chapter 1. Masha. Masha was a prodigy. At 3, she was capable of reading any of the cardboard books in her playroom, and by 5, she was reading many of the books on her mother and father's living room shelf. Whether she understood all the books she read was something her parents would never know, but they secretly thought that she was taking in all the scientific theory and engineering studies that lay between the covers. She seemed to be, at least, but who can really be sure what goes on in the mind of a child? At 5, she could do math at a rate that most third graders would have found impressive. Her father discovered this when he found her doing fractions on the whiteboard he kept in his study. He wanted to be upset. Some of the schematics he'd been sketching were important to his upcoming project, but once he realized that she was solving mathematics that should have been beyond her, his anger had been hard to maintain. At 5, she could name all 50 capitals and states that they belonged to. At 5, she could make the pictures on the TV dance and swirl with nothing but her mind. That last one had been a little harder to quantify than the rest, but Masha was a prodigy, and she could do things that the doctors didn't quite understand. They had taken her to specialists, taken her to researchers, but no one seemed to be able to explain how she did the things that she did. They didn't think it was something to be alarmed about, and it might be something that she would outgrow in time. Her parents hoped the flashing intellect wasn't something she would outgrow in time, but not even they could predict the depths of her abilities. Masha, at 5, had something that she didn't dare tell anyone, not even her parents. When the men from Caltech came to speak with her parents, the pair of MIT graduates didn't understand everything they talked about, but they understood that certain people had recognized Madeline Ariel Sanderson Habersha, Masha for short, was a gifted child and deserved to be in a place with other gifted children. They were offering her a place at their research center in California, and her father had made jokes about sending his only child to Xavier's School for Gifted Children. Through it all, Masha sat between her parents and took it all in. She could speak French and Spanish as well, could read and regurgitate the classics, but she knew that none of her academic achievements were important to these two. They wanted her for the TV trick, but there was more to her trick than that. Sometimes Masha could read minds, nothing that she could strictly control, but Masha had known where to find the Christmas presents last year, when her mother had hidden them in the crawl space instead of her bedroom closet like she usually did. The year before that, she had started crying unexpectedly, saying that she knew there was no tooth fairy. The idea of a grotesquely fat man coming down her chimney to eat her cookies had been horrific to her, but knowing that fairies were make-believe had shattered what little magic lived inside her Philistine's heart. She could get little snippets from Dr. Schuler, the man talking with her parents, but from the man who identified himself as Cal, she got nothing. It was like watching TV static when she looked at him, and the feeling of it made her skin crawl. If she'd been able to peek below his surface, she might have been less sure of herself as she sat between her smugly intelligent parents. She would have seen his true intentions, and their jig would have been up, as her father often said. One look inside Adrian Cutter's mind, and Masha would have been very, very afraid. Dr. Gladdy had been happy to chatter like a bird with the enthusiastic parents, but Cutter was content to sit back and listen. He didn't like the way she looked at them. Cutter had been doing this for quite a while, and he knew that look that now spread across the girl's face. He had told Gladdy to wear his thinking cap, the scratchy metal lid that fit snugly beneath his wig, but the old fool had refused. "I don't like the way it messes up my hair," he'd said. "Besides, Mrs. Habershaw's a technicog, not a telepath." Messed up his hair. Cutter had to scoff at some bullshit like that the hardest. If his time in Iraq had taught him anything, it was bald was best. Cutter turned to look at the little freak and was unsurprised to see her staring at him, showing her his missing teeth as the little bookworm he often traveled with poured honey into her parents' ears. The Blacksites had pairs that went out for extractions, and they always called them toolboxes. Every toolbox had a hammer and a screwdriver, and Gladdy was one of the best screwdrivers at the site. Screwdrivers were for delicate situations, something you needed to turn slowly and not be too rough with. That being said, people sometimes forgot that a screwdriver was just a knife with a hex on it. Cutter had seen Gladdy do amazing violence to people, and it was always because he had a very trustworthy face and a very soft-spoken nature. Cutter was 280 pounds of slab muscle, but Gladdy could get in places that Cutter couldn't dream of without very noticeable damage. That being said, sometimes when the words failed and the shouting started, you still needed a hammer for the less than delicate work. She was still staring at him, that prissy bitch with the middle-aged woman haircut and her smug little smirking mouth. Cutter couldn't wait to see that smug smile slide off her face when he slapped it off. She would take some time to be ground down beneath the stones of the kindergarten, but she would bow. In the end, they all bowed under, even the most stubborn. Well, some of them held on a little longer than others, but that just made their broken little faces all the more delicious. The little girl's eyes perked up for a second, and Cutter was worried that she had seen something. One look at her snooty folks, though, was enough to tell him that they were eating this up. Oh well, princess, whatever she'd seen, it wouldn't matter once she was on her way to the Blacksite. In the end, the scientists posting as Caltech researchers were successful in obtaining Masha. Not right away, of course. No parent would just sign their child away to a couple of strangers who showed up unannounced. First, they would think about it, running their Google searches and checking into the background of the program. They would find out that the program had a sterling reputation, a long list of scientific minds who were very impressed with their findings. Then they'd call the school and do a little checking and find out that yes, the program was legitimate, and yes, the students would be housed on campus, and yes, they would see them after the first 90 days, and so on and so forth. It would all check out, it would all pass board, and when they called the program a week later, Gladdy would tell them that he was excited to work with Masha, and he would see them in 3 days. Cutter silently celebrated as the little academics stepped out of their motel room to smooth over any of the remaining fears the parents might have. He'd spent a week in a bunker hole with a chatty recruit from out west once, and that had been less irritating than close quarters with Gladdy. Gladdy was a good guy, despite being a washout, but he had this habit of liking to yammer that made Cutter's knuckles itch. Cutter had been careful not to be seen anywhere in town, doing his tomcatting and drinking in the next town over, and he was pretty sure that the little academic just sat in the room all day and came up with inane conversational gambits designed to make Cutter grind his teeth. If Gladdy hadn't been such a good talker, Cutter was pretty sure he'd have dumped him in a ditch somewhere long ago. He came back in, hanging up the cell phone before grinning at the apathetic Cutter. "They'll have her ready by Monday. We can have her back at the site by Tuesday if we drive all night." "Good. Sooner we get back, sooner we can get to work." Gladdy smiled, but there was no real mirth in it. "You do love beating children, don't you?" he said, flopping onto the other bed as he reached for his book. "Sometimes. Reminds me of my work in the war. If you can break someone, you have power over them. I like having power over people. It makes me feel good. Sometimes I forget you're a convert and not a washout like me. Cutter snorted. Not my fault you washouts couldn't hack it. Think it's any better on the other side? It's all I hear you guys talk about, how much better it is in the beyond. Gladdy was quiet for the first time in days, and it made Cutter glance away from the TV. Someone on the TV was using a machine gun to cut down a group of Vietnamese soldiers, and when he looked over to the mousy little man on the bed, he could see that a different sort of war was going on over there. Gladdy was staring at the book like he could see through it, and the look gave Cutter the creeps. Sometimes I can still hear those who graduated calling to me. When I'm on level 3, next to the door to beyond, I can hear them singing to me in a language that I might have learned. It sounds like paradise back there. Sometimes I wish I'd been a little better at this, so I was worthy. He was quiet then, and Cutter turned back to the TV and tried not to let the little creep settle too deep into his brain. Monday couldn't come soon enough. "Are you excited for tomorrow, Masha?" her mother asked, tucking her into bed as she got ready for sleep. "Yes, Mommy," Masha said, smiling at her without any real excitement. Tomorrow was going to be exciting, but it was going to be scary, too. She knew that the two men, Mr. Cal and Mr. Schuler, would take her to California so she could learn with people like her. She was a little young to be leaving home, but Masha knew that she was different, and things like this were expected. If she wanted to get better, to get smarter, she would have to do things that were scary. She would have to grow up before she was ready. Speaking of being unready, her mother was trying not to cry as she looked down at her in her bed. I'll miss you," she said. "You know that, right?" Masha nodded, and she did know that. She'd seen it clearly in both her parents that they would miss her, but her parents' minds were complicated, and Masha knew that they wouldn't miss her for long. Oh, they would worry about her. They would hope she was doing well, but they would have their work and have their friends, and eventually it would all just become normal. Her father was already thinking about how he might be able to work longer hours without Masha to cook and care for, and her mother realized how much this would open up her calendar for campus work, especially if she wanted to promote in her department. They weren't bad thoughts, not hurtful thoughts, but they still hurt her a little when she realized that in a way they were looking forward to having more time. "Mommy?" Masha asked as she settled in for bed. Her mother turned to look at her, and Masha heard something clearer now on the edge of her thoughts. "Yes, dear? Would you like to sleep in my bed tonight, like you did when I was younger?" Her mother's tears were harder to keep back now, and when she nodded, Masha moved over so she could climb in bed with her. She pulled her daughter close, their bodies warm as they lay together, and Masha found it easier to read her thoughts when they were connected like this. What she felt was an overwhelming sense of warmth, an outpouring of love for this child that she'd been ill-prepared for. Masha knew that neither of her parents had really wanted children, had picked it up here and there since she first started hearing thoughts, but neither were they unhappy to have her. They loved Masha. They liked having a protege that they could point to as proof of their intelligence. For surely if they had made Masha, then their lives must have meaning, right? As Masha settled in, snuggling close to her mother, something tickled at the back of her mind. When they'd been meeting with Mr. Schuler and Mr. Cal, Masha had been trying to read The Bigger Man and hadn't been able to. But Masha didn't think that was right either. He was like a book that could be read differently if you turned the words, and Masha didn't quite trust him. The big one, Mr. Cal, had been harder to read, though. She'd been staring at him, pushing all her concentration at him, and suddenly she had felt like someone had slapped her in the mouth. She'd never been slapped in the mouth. Her parents didn't believe in physical discipline, but she had hit her face before and knew that it hurt. She could still feel the tingle when she thought about it, and it made her uneasy. Had he been thinking about slapping her? Did he often slap children? Masha didn't know, but as she dozed off, she dreamed about something else she had heard inside Mr. Schuler, or Mr. Gladdy, maybe. It was a song in a strange language, and as she listened to it, it sounded like the sweetest lullaby she had ever heard. "Beyond," she whispered, and drifted off, thinking of that siren song. You're still here. I thought you might be. Thanks for joining me for tonight's story. If your insatiable appetite for horror knows no bounds, might I suggest one of our playlists, or one of our previous stories in the archive? There should be one appearing at the end of the story any minute now. And of course, if you're not subscribed, why not go ahead and hit that subscribe button? Maybe hit that notification bell so you don't miss any of the spooky things that we do here. If you prefer your horror a little more analog, you can always pick up one of my books. There's a link below to my latest, and it'll take you to all the great things that I've posted on Amazon. For my book lovers in the audience, I always suggest coming on down to Patreon so you can become part of my ghostly reader tier and get a book anytime I write one, which is usually about twice a year. Speaking of my patrons, let's go ahead and thank them, shall we? Thanks to Unicorn Hollow for being our spooky ghost contributor. Thanks to Janet and Lady Vengeance for being our spooky skeleton tier contributors. Thanks to Hi Stacy, Winter, Xaronan, Emily Coltsfoot, Stephanie Carrington, Marianne Schuler, Tyler Parker, and Jennifer Damron for being our ghostly reader tier contributors. Thanks, everyone. We just couldn't do the show without you. If you think you might like to support the show in a more monetary fashion, come on down to Patreon. I have many tiers. I'm sure you'll find one that suits you best. I always recommend the Ghostly Reader tier, since you get a signed book anytime I write one on your doorstep. But I have many tiers, and again, I'm sure you'll find one to suit you. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.